So good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of our Practicing Resistance Symposium. For those I haven't met before, my name is Leigh Robb. I'm the curator here at PICA. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land, that we're on Noongar land, and I'd like to pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land, to the elders, past, present, and to future generations. I'd also like to welcome all of our speakers that we have here today. So I'm delighted to welcome our local speakers, Thea Constantino and Peter Farmer and Miranda Farmer, and to Richard Bell for joining us from Brisbane to collectively discuss as artists and thinkers and people and humans the roles of memory and resistance in artistic practice. So firstly, I'd just like to introduce Richard Bell, a man who needs very little introduction, and he's appearing twice here, so he's larger than life. But hopefully you've all had a chance, and I'm sure you have had a chance to see Richard's incredible exhibition upstairs, which is called The Embassy. Richard Bell is a Brisbane-based artist and member of Proper Now Indigenous Artists Collective. And for over 20 years, he has been an artist and a provocateur, and who's challenged the state of art and politics in Australia. And in 2003, he was awarded Australia's top Indigenous Art Prize in the 20th Telstra National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Award. And his work features in most collections, a lot of collections around the country and overseas, including the National Gallery of Canada, and here in the National Gallery of Canberra, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and also the Gallery of Modern Art, and also here now at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, who's recently acquired one of Richard's paintings, which is excellent. So we have some of his work close to home. And Richard was also in the 2008 Biennale of Sydney, and it was less contentious, I guess, and was also shown there alongside William Kendridge. I'd also like to introduce Thea Constantino, who is an artist and an academic who's based at Curtin University. She is the recipient of the 2013 Hutchins Art Prize and also the Qantas Foundation Encouragement of Australian Contemporary Art Award in 2011. Last year she undertook a residency at the Florida Museum and is still working on developing work out of that. But a lot of her research as an artist and as an academic explores legacies of colonialism and the role that creative modes can play in interpreting these histories. And I'll just flag up that she does have a solo show later this year in the Turner, so keep an eye out for that. And I'd also like to welcome Peter Farmer and Miranda Farmer. And Peter is similarly to everyone here, has many guises, wears many hats, and is an artist, curator, an art therapist, and also an art educator. And he's a Noongar artist who was raised in Maribyrnong, but is based in Perth. And many of his paintings are inspired by Noongar dreaming stories, by totems and ancestral lands. Sometimes his working name includes Chirigo, which means blue wren. And those of you who will know Peter's paintings know that the blue wren continuously appears as a totem, and it's something that comes from his great-grandmother via his father, and we'd also like to express our condolences and sympathy for the loss of Peter's father, and are very honoured that you're still able to be here together and to share these stories, particularly this very very personal and sad time. So, on that note, I'll just give you a bit of an overview about the order of proceedings. So, we're going to open up with Richard Bell, and then Thea, and then Peter and Miranda. Everyone's going to speak for around 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to a broader panel discussion amongst all of us, and then open up to a Q&A with the audience here. So I think the best is to hold off some questions until after everyone's spoken, and I do have a microphone this time, so I will make sure that all of you can hear, and I'll come around and put your hands up afterwards if you have any questions. So in the context of this symposium, it does take place at a time when I think nationally and internationally the longer term issues of policy Parliament are being raised around freedom of speech, human rights for asylum seekers, the Racial Discrimination Act, and loosening of legislation around environmental protection. And all of these things are under general scrutiny. It's also a moment when the arts industry in Australia and artists and institutions are compelled to reflect on our own position of political autonomy in relation to, I guess, certain neoliberal state directives, and also critique our own aesthetic autonomy. And this is something that has been raised by each of the speakers in the previous panel. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things that have been raised around ideas of sincerity, empathy, friendship, and human approaches to things. And I think that in consideration of this climate, it's more important than ever to consider the role that artists can and have taken in resistance, and taking quite individual approaches. Everyone on the panel is going to explore in some way, in their own way, the roles of memory and resistance in artworks and artists and practices that interrogate and resist colonial ideologies in Australia right now. Some of the themes that we'll look at will be issues around memory and issues more importantly around forgetting in Australia, and how personal family histories are really important in contesting those colonial ideologies, and ultimately the importance of bearing witness and of maintaining memory and of looking back. And in a way, I think what's interesting is using the term history, because actually, there's history, and then it's actually what's happening now as well. So I think that's something we'll go into, the importance of bearing witness and correcting historical records through counter narratives and through speculative histories that artists offer. And hopefully this forum helps push us to think through new strategies and serves as a platform for rethinking the emancipatory potential of creative practice. And I think today there's a huge amount that's been raised around that, and potential is a really good word in this context. So I think at a time of risk-taking, there's no one more fearless in his critique of Australian art and politics than Richard Bell. And so I think, and given that imagining victory and rewriting art history are driving forces in his practice, on that note, I'd like to get this discussion set in motion and hand over to Richard Bell.
Yeah, well, I got mic'd up for this thing, but I kind of like this thing here. It's a bit like Paul, a bit like Preacher. Yeah, I've seen that picture enough. Well, that's obviously me. That's from a show that I did with Proper Now. It was a drawing show called Just Draw, and I can't draw for shit. So when I got down to the exhibition, the other members of the collective they cut my words, and so they said, "Well, you're going to have to do something else, Richard." So I said, "Okay, I've got that." And there, and I just started writing me, all over the place in different colours and that sort of thing. And that was my contribution to the drawing show. But I'm here to talk about resistance, practicing resistance and the memory of resistance. Well, the memory I have to acknowledge first is that we stand here on Blackwell's Lane, the other side of the country from where I come from. I pay my respects to those people. Right, resistance, bloody hell. My practice, like most others, is a very personal one. It's about much of the experience that I've had growing up in this country, in this most racist of countries. In fact, I think Australia has the world's favourite racists. We're really popular overseas. So I I've grown up in a society where every state had protection laws for Aboriginal people. The result of those protection laws is that in this country, right as we speak, there are more than 169 pieces of legislation, separate pieces of legislation that only Aboriginal people have to live under. Right, and that was, I got those figures from a paper by a man called Lyndon Murphy, who went to UQ in Queensland. He wrote a paper called Who's Afraid of the Dark, so you can look that up for further reference. Since then, we've got the intervention into the Northern Territory, which interferes directly in the lives of Aboriginal people, to the extent like it affects their spending, and we have like alcohol management programs, which were enthusiastically supported by the white people throughout the rest of Australia. And now they have alcohol management programs. Like you're not allowed to drink on the footpath anymore. You've got the 3 o'clock lockout in Sydney and all these sorts of places. So whatever you do to us, they're going to do to you. So whenever they make laws, controlling the behaviour of Aboriginal people, get worried because they're coming after you next. Well, one of the reasons that art is so valuable for us blackfellas is that it allows us to prepare and make permanent records of what's happening now in our lives, in our lifetimes, and recording issues and instances that have happened before in our history. So we're making record of these things, and these records are not just being kept here. So in the future, when they try to cover all this up, it won't be possible because we've got all this other information that's going to be out there. So that's part of the strategies that we have. Leigh was talking about the individual roles of the other panelists. I started thinking about my roles. I'm unteachable, unemployable. So I've got to do something to pay the bills. So what I do is I masquerade as an artist, and I've been really, really good at it. So people think I'm an artist. And as soon as I'm in trouble, I'm an artist. I'm telling you, because artists they get to get away with all this shit that nobody else can do. Well, I'm still a naughty boy. Some people, in this country think that I'm the black boogeyman. And I take every opportunity to reinforce that thought. My whole practice is about resistance. Resistance to the colonial authorities that still remain here. I'm joined by hundreds, thousands of other blackfellas doing pretty much the same thing all around here. We see lots of artists making works about what's happened in their country. This light is really hot on me. So kind of pull this out this way. It's all right. You never had kittens, didn't you? Yeah, well, I see that. Yeah. Anyway, that's really hot. Can you turn that light off? Sun's all over it. And I don't need to read this stuff anymore. I know what the subject is now. It's resistance. That's the thing that when you're sliding down the slippery slope, that's what you need more of. And I often wonder, how is it that this nation keeps churning out generation after generation? It keeps turning generation after generation of innocent children into racists. It's perplexing, like how this happens. But a friend of mine just recently, he went to Melbourne and he caught a cab around about 10 o'clock or something. And this is after some other people had a whole lot of trouble catching a taxi. This friend of mine, white fella, he caught this taxi. Anyway, this guy starts speaking to him in a heavy accent. Oh, I just drive past some Aboriginal people. They don't pay. They are dirty. They are lazy and all this sort of thing. So he just listened to this and he got this lesson on Aboriginal people from this new arrival to this country. And he asked him, how long have you been here? He said, 6 weeks. So in less than 6 weeks, he learned all the stereotypes that are held about Aboriginal people. In 6 weeks, that's all it takes, to turn somebody into a racist against Aboriginal people. So there's something really, really fundamentally wrong in this country. And then we see just this week the Australian government, introducing legislation to change the Racial Discrimination Act. In the same week, this week, we had, the Attorney General say that everybody has a right to be a bigot. We have to demand better. The kind of resistance that is happening that is not happening is, should be being looked at really, really closely by everybody who cares about freedom of speech. Everybody who cares about a fair go for everyone. That's one of the Australian ideals that has been dumped in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, I grew up in an Australia that while it was racist, it was also egalitarian. There was a lot going for this country. It was very, very poor. I can remember growing up during the 60s and 70s and seeing that. Well, the only people in the towns that we lived in who had phones were like the doctors, the lawyers, the accountants, just the professional people. Nobody else had a phone. Nobody else owned a car. Well, owned a new car. Lots of people had second-hand cars and that sort of thing. So it was a very poor country. And yet, it was, there was. This is in the time of Menzies. PICA and Bob, they called him. So, he was seen as being an extreme right winger. Damn. Well, today, the right wing has become the discourse, and the right wing has moved so far to the right now. They've become so emboldened that the Attorney General can say that it's fine for people to be bigots. That is just ridiculous. We've got to try to snatch this argument, this discourse, develop, discussions, that drag the discourse back to the centre. People think that I'm a radical. Yeah, well, I'm from the radical centre. The centre has now become radicalised. I'm one of the in the Black Power movement. All the survivor members. I'm probably one of the most moderate, amongst our group. If white people think they've got problems with me, damn, they want to talk to some of my mates. Especially the women, man. Don't fuck with women. never do that. You know, I learned my lessons. You know, I got cane every time I did. So, how do I get into that? That's resistance. Now we have to resist this this patriarchy. I think one of the other speakers spoke about that. This society, you know, if you have a look at the art world, you know, but don't look at the institutions, you know, because they're full of women. But you have a look at, you know, the art world, you know, man, it's just dominated by white men. You know, like, you know, from what I can see, it's a sheltered workshop for rich white boys. You know, talentless rich white boys. Yeah. So, you know, like, I'm all for, you know, like tearing down the house, you know, like, but I'm also interested in building a new one, you know, like, something that is, you know, building a better house, you know, that is, you know, more egalitarian, that doesn't think that it's not all right to have, you know, free education for the young, you know, like, it doesn't think that public housing is a blight on the human landscape or whatever. You know, like, we can't get these things unless we resist. You know? How's my time going? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Well, otherwise, I'll jump on my soapbox and usually sorry. See you later.
Always a hard act to follow. Well, like many of the other speakers tonight, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Lunana land and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land, past and present. My little talk picks up on a lot of the points that Pete Richards flagged, and it sort of can be read in the context of recent events in Australian politics. So my talk's called Art, Amnesia and the Cultural Logic of White Australia, and I'd like to explore a few ideas related to the fraught relationship that settler nations have with histories of perpetration and the role that artists might play in disrupting or calling into question aspects of national culture that are routinely ignored in public life. It seems to me that mainstream Australia's resistance to acknowledging its history of atrocity has a direct correlation to its blindness to the existence of justice and abuse in the present. And I'd like to propose that art might assist the public sphere in the difficult task of remembering its investment in perpetration. And I think that's what a lot of the other speakers have flagged tonight. So I'll start by noting that settler colonialism is often, obviously, different to other forms of colonialism. While many places formerly occupied by British forces have since decolonised and reinstated local forms of governance, in places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the US, the colonisers sought to replace rather than solely exploit the original inhabitants who never left. Historically, much effort has been devoted to obscuring the foundational violence that constitutes the origins of settler nations and in repudiating the claims of Indigenous communities in order to support the invaders' ongoing occupation and privilege within colonised lands. So many people here will be overly familiar with the story of Australia's federation, the mantra of one nation, one destiny, one people that marked the birth of the nation, the Immigration Restriction Act and the Pacific Island Labourers Act. As numerous scholars like Henry Reynolds and Gassan Haj have noted, the ideological edifice of white Australia casts a very long shadow, and it was enshrined in law for more than 50 years. The rhetoric of our politicians is forever reminding us that it bubbles quite close to the surface, and that their ongoing investment is in colonial structures and hegemonic whiteness. So the recent behaviour of Abbott, Morrison, Brandis and Cabinet is symptomatic of a fairly venerable white Australian tradition, which is the anxiety of losing cultural supremacy to forces both from within and from outside the nation. And as Lorenzo Veracini has noted so aptly, above all else, settlers fear revenge. That such anxieties are still felt in contemporary Australia might seem at odds with an international environment in which nations are expected to act ethically and account for past wrongs, although in reality this ideal is rarely practiced without diplomatic pressure from the outside. been well established that mainstream Australians, which is basically code for white Australians, prefer not to remember the litany of atrocities perpetrated in the name of settlement and nation building, and, you know, the dispossessions, the massacres, the abductions, the abuses, the appalling disadvantage that has afforded such privilege and prosperity to the majority is not lingered on for too long in public discourse in Australia. So, Australia's memory problem has been fairly thoroughly discussed and debated before now. In 1977, W.E.H. Stanton described the white majority's enduring indifference to Indigenous suffering as a glaring omission in popular memory and historiography. He called it an element that sticks out like a foot out of a shallow grave. And similarly, Bernard Smith said that the nation slumbers beneath a white blanket of forgetfulness. And many people will recall the history wars of the Howard years and the efforts of conservative Australia to repudiate a abject past. And here, Veracini characterises such strategy of denial as the primary defence mounted by settler states against the incriminating details of their own foundation, which they must disavow in order to maintain the appearance of national legitimacy and the continuing hegemony of the colonising class. A.W. Moses has linked this resistance to remembrance to perpetrator trauma, noting that the prospect of remembering genocidal pasts directly threatens cherished myths of nation, which in Australia assert the peacefulness of conquest, the morality of government, and the rightful place of Europeans in the geography of the continent. He describes the belatedness of perpetrator trauma, which is only apprehended after the fact, as descendants of perpetrators come to discern the particulars of events. He says, subsequently, the perpetrator collective suffers traumatic recall as the deed, which is only constituted as such in the public memory, enters the consciousness of the population. And the perpetrated trauma continues to haunt the perpetrated collective until it becomes narratable into a new legitimating story and constitutes part of its self-understanding. So what's of interest here and today is his insistence that it's the task of the public sphere to integrate histories of perpetration into the narrative of the nation. The public sphere can form a self-critical community through its reassessment of history and its implications for the present. However, mainstream Australia's resistance to this undertaking is bound up in its ongoing investment in colonial social structures and economies. Australia's historical atrocities are inseparable from the events of colonisation and nation building, and therefore reflect negatively on the fortunes of the nation as a whole. This emphasis on the public sphere as a vehicle for the interpretation and remembrance of histories of perpetration brings me to the role of artists. But before that, I'd just like to mention Habermas's definition of the public sphere as a realm of our social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed. It's a realm where a group of individuals can confer on matters of public interest, free from the intervention of the state, and the public sphere may in fact arbitrate between state and societal concerns. And I think it's useful to think of the gathering today as something approaching that. So the arts, despite having a marginal place in Australian culture, can play a part in such conversations. While cultural policymakers tend to assume that access to the arts will improve social inclusion, enhance tourism, and build a sense of cultural belonging amongst the polity, as we know, art sectors are in fact divided by competing cultural, educational, political, and commercial interests, to say nothing of aesthetic ones. However, where I think that the arts can make a meaningful contribution to the remembrance of histories of perpetration and their legacies in the present day is in what Idalina Conda calls a second narrative of culture, which rather than enhance the experience of citizenship, she says, offers a critical reflexivity which imposes another way of questioning culture, or questioning citizenship in the public sphere, how it is comprised, with what ideologies, segregations, and powers. And such reflexive intent might contribute to the self-critical community that Moses envisions. But historically, Australians rarely adopt cultural change without considerable international pressure, as was the case in the eventual retirement of the White Australian policy, increasingly diverse immigration, and legislative changes in favour of civil rights. And for this reason, a particular challenge to Australian artists is that of diplomacy as well as activism, to speak to audiences at home and abroad about matters that are otherwise poorly represented in the public sphere. As we know, a large contingent of artists in Australia are concerned with unpacking colonial and nationalist histories, and with bearing witness to its effects. As individuals, artists occupy a complex range of perspectives and experiences in relation to the colonial project. And on that note, I'd like to make a note of caution. I think it's important to bear in mind that the cultural logic of white Australia has long and insidious tentacles, that artists are not exempt from its structures simply because they disapprove of it, and I include myself in this little finger wagging. criticism of colonialism doesn't automatically confer moral virtue. I think it's useful to think of Paul Regan's comment, a Canadian, who says, as citizens, we are ultimately responsible for the past and present actions of our government. And as we know, there are numerous examples of white artists who attempt to address Australia's heritage in insensitive, unethical, and just plain ignorant ways. And this has often involved appropriating aspects of Indigenous experience, culture and aesthetics. Just last year, the highly publicised case of Lucas Grogan at Gallery Smith and more recent examples as well. But of course, their behaviour is consistent with the values of Australian nationhood, which is the logic of the settler is to assume the rights of original proprietorship. And it runs deep. But I think that such artists seem to struggle to see their own role in a historical continuum where they participate in and benefit from colonial structures. So while artists play an essential part in bringing this second narrative of culture into the public sphere, to do so ethically and meaningfully, it's important to always be mindful of one's own historically and socially constituted position. For those artists who occupy a place of privilege in Australian culture, this may entail the personal and honest confrontation of legacies of perpetration. And in this sense, an interrogation of nation must necessarily become an interrogation of self.
Hi everybody, my name is Peter Farmer, and this is my wife Miranda Farmer. We're here.
I just wanted to let people know that my husband's father passed just this Friday, so we have a bit of sorry business. He was the main influence for my husband's art practice because we spent probably the last 10 years recording him before he passed. He spent 18 years on this country recording our language, our language. So he is the author of our Noongar Language Dictionary. He started to reintroduce the language into the school systems through my husband and his art practice to try and get our little kids to start talking their own language. So we're a little bit shaky because we're feeling lost. My husband's family is Minang, which is where he was born in Noongar, down south. His mother comes from this country, which is called Wajak country. Her grandmother was born in Kings Park, so he has close connections to Perth through his great-grandmother. He has a lot of connections through country all the way. When you've got more than 150 first cousins, you do. So I wanted to do a bit of welcome to my husband's country. Perth is his great-grandmother's country. It's Wajak country. So I want to pay respect to past and present elders. When we were listening to Richard, we were discussing resistance. And if you see the images on the screen, they are one colour. The blue represents my husband's totem, which we call Chiriga. It's a blue wren. The gold represents my husband's element totem, which is fire, and that is done with a process of gold leaf on canvas. The idea came from a really good white fella in this town that taught my husband at university. He has a couple of degrees, and that person is here, Julian Gollard. So, where are you, Julian? Stand up. Thanks to Julian. He nurtured and encouraged Peter's idea to work with one colour. This again was, like what Richard mentioned, a resistance against what the wider community viewed as Aboriginal art. So he wanted to make his own way, and he wanted to produce it in his own way.
Yeah, look, when the blue ribbon came around, I always spoke to my father, and we always spoke about our culture. And he was a very strong, from where he was born, and the things he did as a kid, and followed up right up until he passed away. So I think for myself is to take that knowledge and, you know, push that further into the wider communities. Just like Bridget said, we, the white Australians, need to understand where we come from, and, you know, we're on this planet as well. And I think as an artist, I can, like you say, when I get in trouble, and I say to my wife, I'm an artist, and she lets me go. So I can wear the colourful shoes out, and people say, why do you wear those shoes? I say, I'm an artist. Then they don't just say, well, I choose the colour, whatever I want to pick off the shoe, and I paint it, I use it. But yeah, look, the stories I gathered from my father, you know, I put to a painting with the blue rings and stuff, and I think it's just all these stories grown up as a young boy that's been passed on to me. Hopefully I can, well not hopefully, I will pass on to my son. I'm Peter II, my son's Peter, Master Peter Farmer, so we've, the old boys are gone, so hopefully one day he can, you know, we have the fourth Peter Farmer. But look, painting the blue rings, I really feel at home. There was an instance, we went to, where did we go? Gold Coast, and me and my son went to all the theme parks, and I sort of, let's go out the front on the lawn and have a bit of lunch. And we sat out, and actually the blue wren actually come and sat on my knee. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, we're right. So, you know, we just get little signs that are close to us to tell us if we're in a different country. We just say we're not here to do anything wrong, we're here to have a look at your country and all that sort of stuff in that way. So I do feel good for having my dad on 43 years, but I've just got a couple of little stories that we wrote as to, not to these pieces, but yeah, well, a couple. One is to this, the blue one, the ultramarine blue, and yeah, it's a triptych. It goes like this. When we reflect upon our lives and how we lived it, what our dreams have been sometimes isn't how things turn out in the end. Which is not to say that we do not like how things panned out. Just that they were different than we expected. And sometimes unexpected can be more a pleasant surprise rather than a challenge. In number one, I have depicted a blue wren breeding. A life already lived, and all that is said and done. Churiga is considering his most precious and unappreciated gift, that being his breath. When you finish a job and you are breathing, or when you have negotiated a big deal, it is a deep breath. It is the most satisfying times when you take a breath and realise the importance of the act that we so take for granted breathing. In number two, I've depicted Churiga Green both at the beginning and at the end. We take off into the world so full of hopes and dreams. So many things to do, so many places to see. With all our twists and turns and trials and tribulations, the beginning takes off. Is the most exhilarating, because no matter how grey and full of darkness the world seems, nothing can stop us from being so wonderfully green. And at the end, when the journey is done, we settle our business and say goodbye to the ones we love. We are still green and filled with hope. In number three is Churiga's in flight with all its splendour and glory days. As the passage of time marches onwards, it seems that one of those we know and love leave us. As in the place does Churiga, it passes from the realm to the next. And in doing so,
leaves us bathed in his brilliant blue colour, to remember him and all his work, that we carry on in the same life, bringing forward his language, Noongar, and culture for future generations to admire and enjoy. This piece was dedicated to my husband's father, Peter Farmer, first. Sorry, I have just one more, I think. Peter did a lot of his work on country in the south. They do a lot of practice, cultural practice. They have a very great responsibility to country, so there's a lot of language and practice involved with getting out and going to the country. So I won't read that one, it's a little bit long, responsibility to country, but my husband wanted to read the one on air and flight. It is an element totem like my own, which is fire. It has a significant role to play. My animal totem could not fly without playing. It could not have lift. It could not soar. It would then be earthbound, and we would no longer look up to the sky. How dreary life would be without flight. Although we don't see air as clearly as we see fire, earth and water, we know it's there, we know its power, we know its destructive force. With its many great storms, but here Chiriga is bathing in its coolness, gliding through its soft breath. Those are some of the stories that Peter has to a lot of the birds that are in flight, like the one that you see on the screen. It's about the stuff that's underneath the bird that helps it take flight.
Look, I just want to say, Richard, as an artist, I do a lot of work through the school systems, and the different responses we get from different kids in the schools. I was actually in year 1 teaching the young kids, and this young guy goes, I was involved with every other student. The young guy sat back, so I said, well, I went back and I said, look, you want to join them? And he goes, I hate black. I said, no, you don't have to use black paint. And he said, no, I hate black. And he's only 6. So what goes on is still today, and it's, it's very strong. But I more or less moved myself back to the group. All the kids were having fun and enjoying themselves. And the young bloke comes me on the side and says, Mr. Farmer, can I join in? I said, yes, come in. And by the end of the class, because what I do a painting before I get into the class, and I pick a student who who I think is going to come along good. And he ended up coming to me and said, look, I'm sorry for saying that. And I said, here, look, my appreciation, you can have this, one of my paintings. And he said, look, I'm going to enjoy this painting on my wall. So we still have those, people being racist, and no matter where we go, I walk down the street and I see a lady coming my way, and all she does is just put the handbag up and walk. And I think to myself, well, if you knew how much money I had, I would. I'll leave you with one. There's a young Indigenous boy and a non-Indigenous boy sitting in the classroom, and the teacher goes, look, we're talking about Adam and Eve. He goes, Adam and Eve took the apple, and the world is a bad place. So the little Indigenous boy sat back and put his hand up. He said, look, miss, put his hand up, he said, if Adam and Eve were black, they would have ate the snake, and this would have been a good world.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, everyone on the panel right now, for taking us through quite an incredible spectrum of approaches to memory and to resistance, and particularly to Peter and Miranda, because it feels like that this is also an act of, it's a memorial, and I think it's an important memorial to have. And thank you so much for coming today at such a particular time to share your stories and your father's stories and the generations before you, that you continue to tell those stories and to share them with us here. And I think some of the questions that I'd like to open up, and then I'd like to open it up to the crowd, is we've been talking a lot about artists and acts of resistance, and by painting in a particular way or making certain works, that those are acts of resistance. And following up on some of the things that Thea said around creating another space, whether that's a second narrative or we could discuss the social sphere or the ability that art and the spaces that we're in right now can actually have an impact, and I think to still see art as having a potential to change things. And I guess these are quite big questions around how other people, how in turn audiences, or how there's other ways that can actually be acted upon beyond here. You know, what do we do after this and from today, and if there's any things you'd like to say on that point.
I just want to thank Peter. I want to thank you too for coming and being part of this. That's all.
Thank you.
As for what comes next, I think that's a harder question to answer. I think that there's certainly a really worrying trend in Australian politics at the moment, which it seems appropriate for artists to respond to, and certainly we've seen the way that the politicisation of the Biennale actually does make it into media and Parliament, not necessarily in a good way, but it makes an impact. I don't know. I think what we need to have is imagination and the possibility of art to extend beyond where we are. I mentioned something about diplomacy before, and I think this is something that Richard does really well. You know, you mentioned that the 10 Embassy had its first showing in Moscow, and you know, as an ambassador for these issues, I think it's extremely important that the international community is given an opportunity to learn about these issues in Australia, because I do believe that this is one of the few ways that change can happen in Australia. It's with pressure from outside, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was under consideration for Venice next year to represent Australia. They didn't bother to ask me for a proposal. My proposal was to wrap the new pavilion in chains, block people from getting in, and setting up a 10 Embassy, and collecting signatures supporting sanctions against Australia.
One thing I have to blame Julian again for is the piece that you see up there is one colour. He really pushed my husband that year to look into the Russian Revolution minimalists. Yeah, all white. And my husband looked at him and said, "You ain't getting me to paint a white canvas." He said, "How about blue?"
Oh mate, I'll wait. Messing up white canvas. I colonised that way.
I couldn't paint a white canvas because I'm black. But it's a big challenge being an artist. I think it's, we come across a lot of things that, how do we handle it? And some of them, sometimes I can handle it, sometimes I can't. And I just think it's a day-to-day thing that, you know, it comes out in my work sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, it's a highly privileged position, I think, you know, like being an artist. For me, it allows me a voice that I would not normally be able to have. And you know, it's really good when you come over to the West here, you know, I get the rock star treatment. very elitist venture, sort of thing. But I think there's nothing wrong with elitism. You know, like, people want to disagree with me. You know, like, they all generally support the idea of elitism in sport. So one of the culture. So yeah, fine. Anybody else got anything to say? Otherwise, I'm going to tell the joke.
Okay, so before we, that happens, let's open it up to the audience. I'll come around and bring the microphone, so anyone has any questions.
Is this right? Thanks for this. And I have a general question that I'd like to first invite anyone to think about it while I move on to a comment, which I'll try to keep brief, and then a very brief personal question. So here we are, Perth Institute of Contemporary Art. We are talking about memory and history of art. And as a relative newcomer to this country, and paying respect to the indigenous people, I'd like to know what are the precedents in art of resistance that you might have thought of and perhaps inspire you, or that could be useful reminders. So while you think for a moment, I'd like to comment on something, or someone rather, that I encountered. I've only been here a couple of decades, which in my life is a fairly modest percentage. And there was this woman from Queensland, and she apparently was worried about the place being invaded by these people with a different culture. And I thought, why would anybody really worry about such a big land being taken over by a small group of people who don't even know the language, are not familiar with the food, how to worry about it? And then I thought another moment and I said, it has been done. If Pauline Hanson had been an Aboriginal elder woman, she would have had every reason to warn people about invasion, and that kind of came to me, an outsider, as an eye-opener, and I think we've been reminded of that by this group, and thanks. The quick personal question is, I like learning languages. Is somebody like me, a late blowing, allowed to learn the Noongar language, and how would I go about it? Thank you.
Hello.
My husband teaches kids in schools, high schools, and also at university. But we have a lot of teachers, so the Land and Sea Council have a lot. My husband uses his large networks in his own family. We have an Aboriginal school that goes from kindy to year 7, and Auntie Roma is probably one of the best known speakers, so we do use her a lot. She interpreted a play, a Shakespearean play, for Kylie Farmer, Peter's cousin, who does a language show on TV for children called Robb.
This question is actually for Richard. And I was really curious about what you just said about elitism in the art world, and how there is that argument about elitism in sport. And I've heard kind of similar things. The difference between high art and how does that affect the Aboriginal community. Now, I've got 2 questions. One is, who decides this? And what do you think of those ideas of high art and in comparison to Aboriginal art?
I think Aboriginal art is on par with every other art in the world. And it should be shown, with every other art in the world, and on an even care. As far as elitism, what are we going to aspire to? Mediocrity? Oh, Oh, well, no, we're doing that now. You know, we just got to look at the Australian art world for like that.
I'm curious about who decides that.
Who decides that? The tastemakers. You know, like people like Nick Mitzovich, you know, like, and others like him.
So then it becomes a particular type of elitism.
I don't know what it's talking about.
Just this idea of elitism in the art world.
Oh, look,
and who decides it, and so then what gets shown?
who decides what is the best and that sort of thing? Well, people like Amy Barrett Leonard, you know, like Leigh, Robb, she's got a bit to do. All these people, you know, they have these things, you know, Julia Triad, like, all these people have these particular roles to play, you know, which, you know, ultimately establishes the pecking order, you know. And then the artists play, it's like a game, you know, like, it's like you have the little leagues, you know, down here, you know, the emerging artists, you know, they have to get up, you know, they play in the big league, you know. Yeah, but you know, like they've got to be able to jump higher than me, you know, because I'm there.
I worked in the ATU tourism back at the Expo, and I was doing, like in the middle of the floor, doing some paintings and stuff, and artists and residents, and one of the guys came up to me and he goes, "Oh, you have nice work," and he goes, "There isn't really any Aboriginal artists in Perth." And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You know, all the good artists come from up north." And I said, "Well, how black am I?" You know what I mean? Straight away, I mean, so we don't get the opportunity, but only lately we've been doing some good work and stuff. But just the thought of comparing, the way I look at it, an artist is an artist, and we all should be treated the same, on the same boat, on the same wave, whatever. You know what I mean? Like Richard, but I'm going to say, you know, we're just as good as anybody else out there with our works. So, yeah. So I'm just going to push the boundaries in my next sort of exhibitions and stuff. Yeah.
Look, the rejection by, you know, at the local level, like, is something that happens all over the country. Like, you know, Goma, you know, like, they, you know, we always complain about them too, you know, like, for the same reason, you know, like, for ignoring the view. But, you know, what we do is we just go back into our studios and we make better work, you know, try to get past them, you know, just by being better. I keep going back to sport a lot. I played professional sport when I was young, very young, a long time ago. And you know, like it was easy you know, to make sure you got into the team. All you did is train harder than everybody else. Yeah, you know, if you worked on your game, you know, you could actually improve, you know, so much that you're going to make that team every time. It's the same with art. You know, it's the same with every endeavour. You know, like if you put in the effort, the extra effort, you know, like you can actually make it into these things, you know, and get included into these big shows, big galleries, this sort of thing. Now, I've never been afraid of that.
There's a few questions. I'd just like to say something about the elitism in art. Australia is one of the few countries in this world where entry to art galleries is free, and not only the entry is free, but a lot of the programs that we have is free. And also, we just had an exhibition called Sculptures by the Sea in Cottesloe, and 220,000 people came to have their picnics amongst the artworks, and it was certainly not elitist. And what we do at the Art Gallery of WA, and I'm the volunteer guide there, is certainly not elitist. So I just like to make a point that art in Australia is abundant, is inclusive as you get it. And if you go to art galleries in Europe, not only do you pay a huge amount of money to even get in, let alone do a tour, but it is far more elitist. And whilst I'm on this subject of how wonderful Australia is, I'd also like to say that it is probably, in my own experience of having come here as a migrant, one of the least racist countries in this world, and I know a few others.
Okay. What do you say to that? I might just, I think we've got time for a couple of more questions. And
Richard, I'm just wondering, when you were saying that if your work is rejected, that it inspires you on to make better work, which I agree with elitism, that's a thing that, that's going to push people to make better work and stronger work, fine. But why is it that if your work is trying to enact resistance, that you need sort of their approval? Why do you need to go through the institutions? Isn't that just sort of reconfirming their power as an institution, if they are the tastemakers? If you're wanting to take some sort of social change, maybe take it out into that arena?
Well, I'm interested in becoming the best human being that I can be. I'm interested in becoming the best artist that I can be. Regardless of the tastemakers, sort of thing. That is my motivation. It's just I want to reach my potential, my full potential. That's what I'm doing with my life. I actually care less, for the art world, particularly Western art, and its institutions. I'd be prepared to participate in a much smaller art world, which was being proposed by people boycotting the Sydney Biennale, with respect to sponsorship. There is no clean money. So, if they're talking about rejecting any sponsorship, and having an art scene that has no sponsorship, which means very little money and that sort of thing, I'm down with that. But I know that everybody will keep taking money from the sponsors. Like if you ask somebody from Iraq, what to describe the Australian government, they would call it a murderous regime that's been involved in illegal wars recently. So you accept money from the Australia Council and that sort of thing. So, I was worried with that argument, with that whole argument. I was worried about the hypocrisy with regard to that, and then there's also the matter, the small matter that transfer was involved in making money out of the intervention as well. Nobody cared about that.
Hello? Yeah. Look, I'm going back to do my Masters in art and PhD, and hopefully I'm going to be the authority on Aboriginal art. There's a lot of people telling me it's gone, it's never going to come back. The culture, it's not, it's there. We still live it.
Yeah, people ask me, what percentage Aboriginal I am. I say 100%, motherfucker. I've been black all my life. That's what I grew up with Aboriginal values, and principles, and that's what I've lived in my life for 100%. So
I think just an answer to that, there are people that have gone out and gotten PhDs and all the rest, right here in this state, that have questioned my husband's Aboriginality. How dark do they want him to be? And how much do they want him to say is a percentage of Aboriginal or not?
100%.
I think it's part of that old assimilationist kind of hangover that
comes from that that question that's about looking for, on the one hand, authenticity, but if authenticity doesn't exist, then there's no problem anymore because it's just a white world. I think it's that logic. And yeah, it's... I think it comes from that desire to kind of diminish the idea that there are people that can make a legitimate challenge to the colonial existence here.
The thing that I found amazing, I went back and did my postgrad in environmental science. We started collecting the oral histories. PICA has a lot of family that are in their 80s and 90s, which is fairly unusual for Noongar people because they died at a very young age. That's why they made Closing the Gap. But the point that I wanted to know was, how was it a transition? For them in their country, they say, we Noongars, doesn't matter what colour, what complexion, it's who we are, where we come from, what we've grown up. So we started collecting those stories. Me, growing up in the city, I thought that they had gone. They still do have their traditional stories. My husband has his totem, he has his language. And I'm sure most of the people in this room are not even dressed the way that your ancestors were 200 years ago. So obviously we're not either.
It was in the anthropological stereotype of a blackfellow. Is like a man with a lap on, dressed in, 1 foot on the knee, holding a spear. Like that person just doesn't exist. A blackfellow is different today than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20. And so there's all these different manifestations of Aboriginality. Right at this moment, and some of them look like white people. And my brother, had red hair and freckles. And Tracy with blue eyes and blonde hair and stuff. It doesn't matter. That's not the thing. And this whole Andrew Bob argument, it's just a furphy. It's there to as a distraction, from other things. You just mentioned in your talk about how white people are threatened by Indigenous authority. So we are Indigenous authority. We have Indigenous authority. So therefore, there's this resistance to it. The manifestation of that resistance is the racism that you can't see, mate.
Look, when I first went back to Curtin University, and I didn't really know my history of how many massacres happened in and around this area, and Pinjarra and Raventhorpe. Honestly, I just felt like punching the first white person to come past me. And I just thought to myself, a lot of that is not taught at school. What happened to our people? So, anything as an Aboriginal person, we do do well. But we've got to put it in another perspective and move on. So we're still going to be angry and what happened for our people, but we're all not bad people.
I'm the body.
I'm not too scared to interrupt, but I think we have just one last question, which I think...
Amy have a question? Amy had a question.
It's a nice
She's
segue.
really patient.
I know it's very patient, but it can be last.
Okay. I think there's a very interesting question which I think which is around different actions that artists can take. So I'll just hand it over to you. We'll have Amy's question, and then I think we will wrap it up after that.
Greetings everybody on the panel. My respectful acknowledgements to the ancestors and the elders and the present people of this land. My name is Mark Ladysmith, and I'm a descendant of white New Zealand colonists. In fact, I'm a descendant directly through my father's line from Mr. Colonist himself, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who sold passage to New Zealand for white people to buy land in New Zealand before the Treaty of Waitangi was ever signed with the tangata whenua of that country. Consequently, I've had an interesting history looking at all of this stuff. My question really for you, Thea, I don't know your family history and what have you. I'm making an assumption here, and please forgive me if I'm not correct, is that you are an artist of white descent. And what are the practices for you as an artist, as a white artist, around these issues that you practice on a regular, if not daily basis, to help yourself stay mindful and to inject into whatever you do, whatever element of pressure, encouragement, what have you, toward change, toward our ethnic peers, if you like, taking up these ideas of questioning themselves about their own assumptions.
It's something that I wouldn't say that I've got a clear answer for. It's something that I think about a lot. Certainly, my work is, people that know my work know that it's fairly preoccupied with representations of history, particularly interested in legacies of 19th and 20th century, I guess Western modes of representation. I find that the more I kind of try to probe this, I try to think about what it means to be somebody with this particular inheritance and cultural inheritance. You know, regardless of when my family got here, I still benefit from a system which is, you know, a Western inheritance, essentially. I mean, I try to read a lot about, and a lot of different perspectives about this particular global set of histories, and a lot of criticism about it. One of the things that I find particularly interesting is people like Amy Morton Robinson, she's an Indigenous scholar of whiteness. And it's this notion that a lot of white people have, that they don't have a race, they don't have colour, that they're a neutral category, and that, you know, somehow other people are defined by them, whereas there's very little self-reflection. So I try to think about my inheritance as a person with, you know, quite a few complicated generational inheritances in terms of one set of great-grandparents had, you know, tobacco plantations in former British colonies in Africa, so it doesn't, you know, I'm not free of any of these entanglements. So I've got a few ways of tackling it. The work that I'm making at the moment is called Daughters of Empire, and I'm kind of reflecting on the role of white women in the history of colonialism. I'm interested in looking at moments of decolonisation. So, for instance, when people might have left, you know, the British might have left Rhodesia, for example. What does that moment look like of somebody who's occupying a sort of subordinate position within patriarchy, but at the same time occupies quite a lot of power within their particular environment? What does it mean when they suddenly lose that power? I'm interested in that kind of moment of crisis, because I think that in probing that you can, I don't know, reveal certain insights about the exercise of power and how power is worn, how it's enacted, and that kind of thing. Another body of work I want to look at is representations of death in, you know, kind of colonial narratives. So one thing I want to look at is the story of Burke and Wills, you know, these explorers who set out, I think, from Melbourne and died somewhere in the north of Australia, and the way in which their death has been romanticised and historicised and cast one of the strategies I use quite a lot is kind of satire and the grotesque to try to at least shift the interpretation of those things. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I guess I just keep trying.
I've got one.
What's your answer?
Oh, you got any money? Give it to me. You got any houses? Give them to me. That's my fucking solution. If you feel guilty, give it to me.
That's kind of where my question was coming from, Richard, because one of the things I kept encountering over the years in New Zealand, thank you, was white people being full of a lot of angst about asking these questions of themselves. You know, we really need not be nervous. It's the challenge is there to ask these questions and ask them courageously. And it's good for us to share with each other how we actually do that. I was very encouraged some years ago by a white friend of mine who was challenged by one of her Māori activist friends about what she was doing amongst her own people to raise awareness and to make change around the past and ongoing effects of colonialism. And she really thought about that and took that up and decided that she was going to go around talking about colonialism as a white person to members of the Country Women's Institute, the White Women's Institute in New Zealand. And at her first gathering, she stood up and she said, "Hello, my name is Stephanie and I'm racist." And everybody went, "Oh," you know. But her point was, as came out of her narrative, that I'm not afraid of this, and I have to assume that that's part of my being in some way, in ways that perhaps I've become aware of and I've addressed, and in some ways that I'm not aware of. And, you know, encouraging people to go on that journey.
That's a great comment that you made about people being aware of their history. I went to school with a group of people, I'm not really that old, that didn't know anything about their own history. They didn't know anything about Australia. I asked them, where did they come from? They didn't know that they were Irish or British. They said, "Oh, I'm Australian." So, you know, we as Indigenous people, we like to know who we are, where we come from. We connect to that land and country. It's a very, very strong connection. You've been on this continent for 60,000 years, you're going to feel it. Your hair stands up sometimes when you go places and it moves you. So if you are brave, find a path and you find yourself in a lot of treats along the way.
Where's Amy? Can we give Amy's question?
I'm saving it for upstairs, Richard.
Oh, okay.
She's saving it for you for later.
Oh, right.
On that note, thank you so much to everyone, to Miranda, Peter, Thea, Richard, and thank you so much to everyone in the audience. I feel like the heat's really been turned up, both, I think the air conditioning's been turned up, and in general in terms of the level of discussion, and it's, you know, I have to say it is often quite unusual to just really sort of open things up and have quite frank discussions, which I feel like everyone did today, which is, yeah, we appreciate it a lot. And that can continue, but also, we're going to wrap it up now. It's about 15 minutes, and hopefully all of you will join us upstairs in Richard's exhibition and in front of his tent embassy for a final session. I think throughout the day we're gradually unpacking things and opening them up, and so it'll be round table, there'll be drinks, beers, snacks, things to fuel to keep it going. So, yeah, I encourage everyone to come upstairs and look forward to everyone sharing their thoughts. Thank you again.